Well, good evening. Welcome again to another rendition of Friends, Food, and Faith. It's our August version. So I thought it might be appropriate to talk about the assumption and primarily why it's either necessary for the assumption to happen or fitting. Now, those are two different things, right? So things that are fitting aren't really necessary, and things that are necessary would automatically be fitting, right? So we want to be very clear about those terms. Because the first thing you might think is, well, is it necessary? So what do we think? Is the assumption of Mary necessary? Yes? Maybe?
Never thought about it.
Yeah. No, I think that's something good to reflect on. Let me be clear about this. The church doesn't teach anything definitively about this, whether it's actually necessary or not. Theologians posit, and there's good. No, let me clarify this. Let me clarify this. The church teaches it happened, right? It happened. It is dogma. It is teaching of the church that Mary was assumed. That is a reality that we must believe with our hearts and minds. Whether it's necessary or not, that's kind of an open question, right? So, was it necessary for Mary to be assumed? Well, we would reason that, well, because God ordained it, then therefore it would be necessary, right?
Fitting for sure.
If he says it's going to happen.
If you said it happen, it's definitely going to happen, right?
Well, if she's without sin, why wouldn't she be assumed?
Good. Good.
Yeah.
All right. So let's put it this way. There is also a tradition of the church that St. John the Baptist was born without sin. Now, did he sin during his life? Well, we don't know, right? We know for sure Mary didn't. There's even kind of thoughts that St. Joseph may have been born without sin, not conceived, but born without. Right? Again, these are open teachings, right? So yeah, I think it would be definitely fitting that Mary, because she was without sin, would be taken body and soul into heaven. More so because of what we hear in the Old Testament. So let's ask this question. This might be more clarifying. Was Mary the first to be assumed into heaven?
Well,
You assume not since.
let's see. Well, Elijah.
Elijah, all right. Elijah
So
was
is
brought
that-
into heaven, right? He was.
is that-
We're told in the Book of Kings that a fiery chariot came down, and Elisha, his apprentice, witnessed this. Right? It's recorded in the Book of Kings that a fiery chariot came down, picked him up, took him up to heaven. Okay. Is there any other figures
Well,
for
Moses
Mary?
died, but they couldn't find his bones.
Moses, it's assumed, right? Because today we celebrate assumed. Today, as we celebrate the Transfiguration, one of the figures that appeared on Mount Tabor, right, it was Moses, right? So why would a Moses appear if he's not in heaven in the glorification of Jesus, of showing who he truly is?
But he could be in heaven and not be assumed.
You're right. He could be there in his soul, but then maybe the deeper question is then, what does a human soul look like? Because it was very evident that it was actually Moses, right?
Yes.
So if it was just a spirit or just a soul, would there be an appearance of the bodily form of Moses in that soul? Now, we know angels can take on different forms, right? But it seems that a human soul cannot. Or at least it's thought it not, right? Because we don't necessarily know for sure. We just know that we can't change our forms while we're in this bodily state, right? And because that our let's put it this way. Our features would say this. So we can maybe lose
don't
weight.
Transform
Right, yeah. So like in other words, we can't change
lose
into a
some
giraffe.
weight,
Yes,
some
yeah.
plastic surgery.
But we can't change the nature of our soul to change into a giraffe or something, right? So an angel could appear as a giraffe if the angel so chooses. Why would they? I don't know, but still. So the question could remain: could a human soul then, once it's free of this body, appear in different ways? Well, maybe, but also it's interesting that human souls are the only souls that are made in the image and likeness of God. So because of that dignity, it would seem that why would a human want to change into anything other than a human that's made in the image and likeness of God? In which case, what is our identity our unique souls? How does that present itself outside of the body? So your point, Dan, it's I mean, it's possible just his soul, sure, we can hold that. That's not necessarily anything that's heretical or problematic. But it also would be a good indication that Moses probably was also assumed.
Well, could be, but the apostles didn't know exactly what Moses looked like. So whatever shape appeared there, they're going to assume that it's
Well, I
Moses.
don't know, because what's interesting though, because we're told in Scripture explicitly,
Yeah.
but it's never explained to them. At least
How
not.
they knew it was Moses.
Yeah, it was explained to them this was Elijah and Moses, but they were for some reason
Knew.
intuited that, right? Yeah, there was some act, whatever, that caused them to recognize, oh yeah, this is they.
Was he holding a copy of the
Maybe,
commandments?
right? Maybe, yeah. Maybe the staff. Who knows, right? There could have been some indications, right? Yeah, we don't know,
It was
right?
word of mouth back then. They didn't have that much in the. We didn't have.
Yeah, you're right.
Photographs,
So, right. So the teachings were handed down orally, right? I mean, so at that point there would have been written down things, but the tradition and the Scripture would hand down still have that tradition of orally handing down from generation. That's true. We were not told anywhere in Scripture there's actually a description of Moses, as far as we're told that he gleamed white, right? He glowed after he was in the presence of God, and maybe there was a veil over his face. Maybe that could be right. So yeah, there could be indications of saying these things. We don't know. Were there any other figures predating Mary that were assumed in heaven?
You've stumped us.
There's one in particular that's only mentioned very, very briefly. He's mentioned once in Genesis, and he's mentioned once, I believe, in Hebrews. And his name is Enoch, right? So we're told that Enoch walked with God, which is a way of saying that he was brought body and soul in heaven, right? There is a book of Enoch, which may have been part of worship, but at the time of Jesus it fell out of use, because that was something that happened typically in the Jewish tradition, that there would be books that would come into use and come out of use in the synagogue worship. Even today we see that in many congregations of the Jewish people. But at the time of Christ, Enoch was not part of the canon, so to speak, that be used in synagogue worship. And it's probably for good reason. Has anyone ever read the book of Enoch?
Yeah.
Good. So it's not, I mean, it's an interesting book. And as a matter of fact, well, it's actually, has anyone ever seen the movie, the one that had Christian Bale playing Moses? I think it was just called Moses. I'm not sure. It was like a recent movie, maybe in the last 10 years or so. Well, in this movie, it was kind of depicted as God as like a child and kind of grew in knowledge and wisdom. And so that kind of came from the book of Enoch. So the book of Enoch kind of portrays God as this being that grew in intellect and wisdom, right?
That's what Jesus did.
Well, let's be clear about this though. So why would that be problematic?
Because God always was.
Yeah, God cannot grow. Now to your point, Kathy, we can say, well, Jesus grew. Well, yeah, but there was always a recognition that Jesus was God, even by himself.
Right.
Now, we can understand that Jesus grew in his, what we call experiential knowledge. So, because prior to the incarnation, God didn't have a body. So even though God could definitely comprehend and design and understand what it meant to hammer a nail into a board, the experience of that may not have happened until God actually had a body to actually hammer the nail into the board in a human way. So yes, that we could say that Jesus grew experientially.
It says that in Scripture. After he was lost in the temple, he went home with his parents.
Yeah, but we want to be clear about what we're actually
Okay.
talking about there, because if
Okay.
we say that he grew, if we said we grew, he actually grew in divine wisdom. Well, that'd be problematic,
Okay.
right? Because, well, how can God do that? Because he's God,
Right.
right?
His human experience.
Right.
His human experience can grow, but his divine experience cannot, right? And that's a mystery in some ways, right? Because we don't necessarily know exactly how that works together. We would say that Jesus's human soul would be submissive to the divine, right? Because Jesus did not have the capacity to sin. unlike Mary, who did, right? So again, there's sort of a play there about how that would work. That's sort of mysterious that we wouldn't maybe know until we're actually with God in heaven, right? Um, but that also kind of shows, the everything about Mary kind of points to her son as being both man and God, right? So this aspect of the Assumption seems like it's not only a great glorification of God, but also great honor directed towards Mary. And being that there were other figures that were, we would say, less honorific, right? Because we would not hold that Moses or Elijah or Enoch were greater than Mary. Because they sinned. They still sinned, right? So they still had sin on their soul. And even they had sin on their soul, following God's will, they were assumed. So we would say that Mary would be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, in at least in the human nature. So yeah, so again, would it be necessary though for those figures to be assumed that predated Mary? No, I would say probably no, right? I mean, so in other words, it doesn't necessarily add any other honor or anything to our nature by having these figures be assumed in heaven. But it does point to something real and something we hold true as Catholics and Christians, namely the resurrection of the body, right? So in that respect, we would say that, well, maybe it was necessary that Mary be assumed and these other figures be assumed as a type, right, pointing towards this, what we call teleological end, to which we're all destined, meaning we're all meant to have our bodies reunited with our souls in heaven. And it just so happens these figures didn't have to wait for that, or maybe it was at least revealed through them that this was a reality and a tenet of the faith, okay? Because the other aspect of this is we're also talking about things that are outside of time and space. So as far as like when the resurrection of the body happens for us, sure, as I was having a discussion earlier about this with someone, and these things that are eternal, we think the things of heaven, the acts of Jesus on earth, are not just actions that happen in time, these are also eternal actions. And we would say the Assumption of Mary would also be an eternal action, that it happened, is happening, and will happen all at once. Now, for us that are governed by time and space, that is completely incomprehensible, right? Because we are used to a chronological order. There is a past, there is a present, there is a future, and those happen in an order that lead to this particular end. But in heaven, they're all the same, right? So from that aspect, we'd say, well, yeah, maybe it was necessary that Mary was assumed so that we would actually understand the reality of the resurrection. Now, others could argue, wasn't Jesus' resurrection enough? And we would probably say, well, yeah, I mean, sure, that does make sense. It should be, right? Should be, right?
But
Right.
what else
Right,
would
right.
happen? Why else would she not be assumed?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I mean, you could also argue that because Jesus is fully God, that, well, yeah, well, that would apply to God, but for us lowly humans, would that apply, right?
What are you gonna do, just leave her alone?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, no, that's another aspect, right? Yeah. So, being that she has the honor of being the mother of God and is the new Eve, it would even seem more proper, or at least fitting, that she would be assumed. Also considering these other figures were also assumed. Right?
Considering she wanted to go with him.
Correct, and also engaged in his passion. Right. So
Like,
because
let's do this.
yeah, so in other words, the Assumption does point in many ways to the Immaculate Conception and the Annunciation. So the fact that Mary was conceived without sin in the womb of Saint Anne, our patron, but also she knew what would happen to her son in saying yes, right? So there's and I'm talking this probably more when Immaculate Conception comes around, but it's a great musical song, I suppose, and it's not necessarily like a bad song, but theologically it's just completely inaccurate and problematic. And of course, the song I'm talking about is "Mary, Did You Know?" Right? We hear that during Christmas. Actually, it was written by a comedian, a Protestant comedian back in the 1980s, and I don't know if it was necessarily meant to be a comedic, but I mean it's kind of taken root in some. I mean, I was talking to one of the Newman students, and she was saying that that they have the down for church as one of the Christmas hymns. Like, oh, all right, well, fine, whatever. To each their own, I suppose. But the problem with that song is that when you say, Mary, did you know? Well, yeah, she had to have known, or else it wouldn't be a free yes. Now, she may not have known exactly how it all came about, but she would have known because of this grace given to her that she would witness the passion, death, and resurrection of her son, right? And in that way, she would conform and participate in that suffering. And as her son was raised body and soul, she was also told that she would be raised body and soul. So these all kind of work together. And so in that respect, we could say, yeah, maybe it was necessary because God ordained it that way, right? God can't be untruthful. So once God proclaims it, it has to happen, and therefore be necessary. So I think the way we can also understand this too is looking back to Genesis, right? So Genesis, in the fact that the original humans were made in the same way as Mary was made, meaning they didn't have sin. They were given what they call the preternatural gifts, right? So they had full knowledge. They could see God face to face. They had sense of original justice and innocence, right? That was lost during the fall. That through that, Mary didn't take the same route as Eve and reformed human nature back to its original situation through also the new Adam of saying yes, for bringing back the new Adam, Jesus, right? So in other words, if Mary truly is the new Eve, it would make sense that she would also enjoy the gifts that were given to Eve if she didn't fall, right? So all these things to say is that, yeah, they're definitely for sure fitting, right? Necessary might be an open question, but I think you're making arguments either way. Now, one of the questions, which I'm going to probably leave open because I'm thinking about doing my homily on this, but I'm not really sure yet for the Feast of the Assumption. But the deeper question may be, did Mary die? Now,
Define death.
well, so
Right.
a cease of a separation of body soul in some respect, that there's a ceasing of life in the body. Okay, so if we look again at the Old Testament,
If she was assumed body and soul into heaven, then you would say, no, she didn't die.
okay, did Moses die?
Well, it said he did.
Said he did.
Yeah, so he died, yet he was assumed, we would think.
Yeah.
Elijah, well, we're not sure. Maybe could something happen between the fiery chariot bringing him up or something? But at least he was alive when he left.
There's no
right?
witnesses once he got
Right, exactly.
taken
Right.
up in the whirlwind.
So that's definitely an open question, right? I think fundamentally the question comes down to, would Mary do anything greater than her son? So if her son died, would it make sense that she would too?
Well, who can outdo God?
But also, the other argument against that would be, wouldn't it be a greater glorification of God if she didn't?
And she was the mother, and you do take care of your mom.
Sure.
Right, which is why you took her. Yeah.
So I guess, in reality, that this is kind of, I think, some of the objections we have from our Protestant brothers and sisters that, what they look for is from a sola scriptura standpoint of, well, it's never said in the Bible that Mary was assumed, or that she even died. So yeah, okay, cool, whatever. But there's a lot of things that aren't in the Bible that we would assume happened too. And I think also too, we made some arguments to say that it would be more fitting that she would be, right? So why would we not believe that? If Mary truly is Mother of God, which we hold true, and that's not, and I think we also want to be very clear, as looking at Mary as like the new Eve and Jesus as the new Adam, the assumption could be made that deifies Mary in some way, right? Because even though Adam and Eve weren't God, now the new Adam is, wouldn't the new Eve also be, right? Well, that's when we want to make some distinction, right? We want to say, well, not necessarily. That we definitely would honor Mary as because of her yes, because of who she is. And also, it would make sense that Mary, if woman and man are the full image of God, it would also make sense that both women and man would be in the eternal reward together, and that to be that symbol of the same image, right? So in other words, if Adam gets in heaven, Eve would have to get in heaven too. And body and soul, which would make sense. But we wouldn't say that that would actually deify Mary to the point where she becomes like the quadrinity. Right? You know, so we want to be very careful about that. Queen of heaven, but definitely not God.
Right.
Yeah, right. So we would be very careful about those things. And I think that's also another way why it would be more fitting that Mary would be assumed, because, you know, if you understand back to Genesis that the image of God is made, the image and likeness of God is made male and female, that it would make sense the new Adam and new Eve would also be. Now some theologians would posit that Mary's entering into heaven allowed other saints to enter into heaven. So we understand that by the fall, that closed off heaven to anybody, right? Except for a certain few, because we would say that, you know, Elijah, of course, and, you know, these guys. But everyone else would not be able to get into heaven. Now, I think this, again, might be an open question. I would probably push on this a little bit, but some theologians will argue that it wasn't until Mary was assumed that Sheol was empty. Now, there's a problem with that. Well, so we would say that in the there is a so
Isn't there a 16 years or 11 years where Mary lived after Christ died?
I mean, we're not really sure. It definitely would have been, there's some time, right? Because she lived with John, you know, there was some time. Yeah. So, and that was 50 days. So, I mean, at least, you know, but we would also hold that Jesus did descend to the realm of the dead to free the souls there too. Now, we tend to, in our tradition, hold that happened on Holy Saturday. So while his body was in the tomb, Jesus went down to Sheol, the underworld, to free the Old Testament figures that remained faithful. And I think that's a good interpretation.
Well, our Eastern brothers have that tradition, and also Mary, the Dormition of Mary.
Mm-hmm.
But they have icons for thousands of years of those.
Yeah. Yeah. So are you saying? So yeah, the point I'm trying to make though is that I would think that Mary's assumption into heaven would not necessarily open the gates of heaven. That would be done through the actual act of Jesus ascending, right? And so we want to be very clear about that, because you'll find some theologians argue that because of this full image entering into heaven, that wouldn't happen until the full image actually opened up the gates.
So how do they explain the good thief?
Yeah, good. They would actually hold the good thief didn't actually go straight into heaven.
Oh. Today you'll be with me in paradise.
Well, so here's the thing. So here's listen, I'm not holding this. I'm telling you what other theologians are holding. So I think the way they would argue that would say that, well, we're talking about something in eternity. What would that really mean for God?
But on
right?
the other hand, he was suffering on the cross.
Jesus
so
was,
yeah. So
oh, you mean the thief?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
So I mean, yeah. Or is he participating in the sacrifice of Jesus? Yeah, I would say sure. But again, well, okay. Could there be a time, whatever that means, in the eternity?
What are you saying? You got there before Jesus? Jesus didn't rise yet.
I mean, well, but Jesus did die though before the thief. So
he'd be with him.
Right.
With
Yeah.
him.
So if you're saying, so the argument is that he's down in Sheol, Jesus went down to Sheol. Hey, how you doing, Dismas? Give me a minute. We gotta wait for my mom to come through first. You know, that kind of thing. Right, yeah. But he said with me in paradise too. So it's like, well, all right, yeah.
Perhaps
So
theologians overthink things.
That is a good
if
point.
It's fact,
That is a good point. But I think the point we want to make is that doesn't necessarily affect our faith. So in other words, whether it was that day or whether it was for a time, whatever it is, we understand that again, God would still bring these people into heaven, provided they were willing to do so and open to it, right? And so that was the point of Jesus sending them to hell, is that, you know, because the gates of heaven were closed to people before the coming of Jesus, that his actions were the ones that freed them, not Mary's actions, his actions. Now, you could make an argument that, well, yeah, that does make sense. The full image entering the heaven would kind of be a good cyclical kind of, you know, fulfillment, right? Maybe, right? I don't think we necessarily. Again, these are not things we have to hold as Catholics. It's open questions, right? And so you can hold really either position. But what you have to hold is that she was assumed, and you have to hold that Jesus did descend into hell, and you have to you have to hold that the body would rise, right? So the resurrection of the body. These are part of the oldest creeds that we hold dear, the Apostles' Creed. So how that all happens, those are usually particularly very open. And I think what that points to is kind of how the church does kind of remain open to these possibilities, right? That we definitely can hold, we have to hold certain things that occurred, right? Because they are eternal things. But how that all happens, well, those are open.
Right.
So whether the assumption of Mary actually opened the gates of heaven or not, well, that still happened through the sacrifice and the action of Jesus, regardless, right? Even the fact that Mary was immaculately conceived happened through the action of Jesus, right? That it happened retroactively before Jesus became incarnate, but that still was God acting regardless.
Part of the plan.
Right, because it's the other part too, that the actions of Jesus are so eternal that they not only affects of the future, but also effects of the past, right? So that's why it's kind of hard thing for us to grasp these things, because we're talking about things that are not governed by the things that we experience, right? That they're outside of these things. And so is it possible that these occur not necessarily in our linear time frame, but in this eternal time, whatever that means? Sure, yeah, we would hold that. Again, theologians can be helpful in helping us to kind of reason certain things, but in other ways that, yeah, maybe they get a little overthinking on certain things too, right? Yeah, so I think that's kind of the gist. Are there any questions or comments or thoughts about that? Yeah, I think we're going to kind of talk with the question of whether Mary died or not. So the point you were making up, Kathy, we brought up the dormition. So what does dormition mean?
Isn't it basically the same as the Assumption?
Well, it's the same feast. So in the East, this tradition of celebrating liturgically came from the Eastern Church, and it was called the Dormition of Mary, right? And then 1950 actually became dogma, right? John the 23rd, who proclaimed it a tenet of the faith that Mary was assumed in heaven. So it's kind of fascinating that like 1,500 years, even though it was being celebrated liturgically, it wasn't actually a dogma. Same with the Immaculate Conception. The Immaculate Conception wasn't actually proclaimed, promulgated as dogma until 1858. Even though it was celebrated in the church since the very early days of the church, right? What's also fascinating about these things is kind of thought that they're the only promulgations of the Pope by himself. So both the Immaculate Conception and the Assumption of Mary didn't come from a council, they came just from the Pope and his authority as the Pope to make these declarations, right? The Immaculate Conception was the very first one after the Vatican I, which declared the Pope can make these promulgations, right, under certain circumstances. One of which has to be it has to be in contact with faith and morals, right? So it has to be some tenet of faith and morals. And it has to be done in line with the teachings of the church, right? So in other words, the Pope cannot contradict anything that's already been taught. And it has to be done as the Pope.
No.
Okay. So in other words, what that means is he has to do that as a successor of Peter in his role, meaning it has to be official. So he can't be like, have a reporter ask him a question and says something like, well, I as the Pope say this. Well, that doesn't really count, right? It has to be promulgated in a normal way through some writing, right? Some would even argue it has to be done in Latin. Because that's the mother tongue of the church.
Hebrew and Greek.
Well, that's
and
the
all
reason
that
being is because every other promulgation of the Pope has always been in Latin, and so being the mother tongue of the church, it would not be translated, of course, but it wouldn't be official unless it was done in Latin. I don't know. That seems a little extreme, but regardless, that this came from Vatican I, the First Vatican Council, and that was the only thing promulgated out of the First Vatican Council. And it actually has some context and connection with our own archdiocese, because the Archbishop at the time of St. Louis, he left the council early without signing that promulgation. Does anyone know who the Archbishop was?
I'm not even sure when Vatican I was.
1854. It was not Glennon. Glennon was
Rosati?
way later.
This has been our own Archbishop Kenrick.
Kenrick.
We have our
Oh.
seminaries. Yeah, our seminary. So Kenrick actually was Archbishop here for a very long time. It was about 50 years. But he left Vatican I early, not necessarily agreeing with this promulgation of the council that the Pope could make these infallible statements.
Is that why he left?
Yes. At least that's what was the thought to be. So he was actually hunted down by the papal legates. And once they caught up with him, they said, Archbishop, you have to sign this. To which he said, well, if the council deems it so, then therefore it would be promulgated, right? So in other words, he was saying the authority of the Pope still came from the council. That was his big problem, was that, well, outside of a council, that doesn't make any sense. But it's always been tradition of the church that something doesn't become dogma or doctrine until the Pope promulgates it, right? So it was sort of like, well, which one comes first, that kind of thing. So he did reluctantly sign it. The only bishop that did not sign it was the Bishop of Little Rock, Arkansas. I think it's because he died. I'm not really sure. Anyway, but yeah, it was thought that these two dogmas were the only things that are promulgated by the Pope. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily true, because there have been other writings that if you read them, you typically read in these papal documents, there are certain words that are used, certain phrases. So like, for instance, the Pope would use something like, I as a successor of Peter, or as the Bishop of Rome, in league with my brother bishops in the teaching of the church, do hereby decree this matter. Typically, when you hear those words, that's something that he's saying infallibly. And so if you look at some of the documents that came after Vatican I, specifically, really more recently, like Humanae Vitae, or some of the Dignitaris Mulieribus, or Sacerdotes Presbyteris, right? So these doctrines that kind of talk about not only the sexual ethics that came out of with Humanae Vitae, but also like the nature of holy orders. It seems that like Paul VI made some very infallible statements when it comes to things like contraception, abortion, that kind of thing. And John Paul II made some very, seems like infallible statements when it comes to the male priesthood. So it's kind of funny, these issues tend to pop up even today. And maybe it's interesting that we're having election day today in some ways when we're talking about these things. But it seems that there are certain things that are stated that were held to be infallible. The problem is it's so, how should I say, ambiguous that there tends to be debates. Like, so many of us may remember, maybe we're alive, maybe we weren't, but when Humanae Vitae was promulgated, it was panned by many, including bishops, right? Who were like, oh, that's not infallible. You don't have to really worry about that. But if you actually read it, it's like, I don't know, it seems like we need to worry about this, right? So time, I think, tends to tell with these things, but it's kind of fascinating that, it's only universally thought that there were two things promulgated by the Pope on his own, and that had to deal with dogmas on Mary. And part of that could be because they thought the Pope's maybe thought that was pretty safe. When the church has been celebrating this for, over a millennia, I think we could probably say it's pretty safe to actually say these things, right? So yeah, but I think what's very fascinating is they're very more contemporary.
So is
life
there
of
any
church.
teaching on how long Mary had to wait to go to heaven?
You mean after the Assumption? Or I mean
After-
between the
well,
resurrection and the Assumption?
Yeah, after there's no real.
We don't know for sure. I mean, so for instance, what's kind of funny is if you go to the Middle East today, there are like several places that actually hold that Mary lived there with John. All right. There's like 4 or 5. So it's like, oh, okay, well, is it possible she lived in each one of them? Well, maybe. John would have been moving around. We know that by the time John died, Mary was probably assumed because, that's just the age gap probably would have happened. As far as how long, we don't really know how old she was. we would think that she probably was in her late 40s when Jesus died. If she was 14 when Jesus was conceived, she would probably been about 47 when he was crucified. I mean, being lifespans weren't that long that time, but also she had these prenatal gifts, right? So she had, so who knows, right? There's different theories you could actually come up with. I mean, could she live to be 100? Well, I mean, if Adam and Eve lived to be 400, 500 years old, sure. Now, I don't think we would hold that Mary lived to be 300, 400 years old, but it is interesting that the tradition of that liturgical tradition of the Dormition of Mary didn't come about until about the 4th century. So like 300
But her
years after.
mission was done, so why wouldn't she get to go?
Yeah. But okay, so
She did her
well, hold on now.
and then he's
Now
gone,
that's an
and
interesting
she's
point
like,
there, Renee.
what about me?
Was her mission done?
Well, after that's why she had to wait, because she had to help the apostles figure things out and all that. And I think the assumption for me is very it's very comforting, because at least Mary had to be patient and wait too. Because she wanted to go with him, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And
well, now there's
she had to wait.
There's some interesting
until
things
it was
about that,
her
right?
time.
So first off, at the foot of the cross, right? Jesus gave Mary to John.
Right.
Now we also see that well at that point, Mary, who was also the mother of God, became the mother of the church. So you're right. She still had a mission when it came to the church. So how long would that take to get the church all ready to go and
She's still
establish?
doing it. She's still
Sure.
in the process.
Which is why the woman in Revelation is also in pain. So
Right.
we would say that was actually Mary, but where Mary maybe had not necessarily a painless, but a less pain birth with Jesus because of the preternatural gifts. Being that she became the mother of the church, she would be in pain from the sin that we cause her son.
Correct.
So yeah, there definitely would be pain involved with that. How long would that take? Could it be hundreds of years? Could it be,
Well,
50,
if she's united with
60?
if she's united with Jesus, then
Well,
until
so
every one of her people come home.
another factor that we need to actually include in this, and this kind of all goes together, is she would never have been separated from Jesus even after the ascension into heaven, because Jesus gave her priests and bishops to bring him about
Right.
anytime she wanted, which is what we have today in the Eucharist.
Being spiritually connected and physically connected are two different things.
Right, but the Eucharist also is his body, blood, soul, and divinity. So there would be a physical connection regardless.
Well, and the mystics do write about that for the fact that she was there at the Last Supper,
Right.
even though she wasn't there
Right.
at the Last Supper.
Right.
So
So I think we want to be, it's interesting that we can kind of debate this, because we don't really necessarily have a time frame when she was actually assumed to heaven, right? So back to the question about the Dormition. Dormition means sleep. That's the Latin word dormire, which means to sleep. So it still doesn't necessarily answer the question whether Mary died or not. But that's at least in the Eastern Church, where they thought that she kind of slept and then was taken into heaven. But again, we don't necessarily have a time frame on that. So it's still kind of an open question when that happened. And you can, again, debate whether, well, if she had the preternatural gifts, that means she would give him long life. Yeah, technically she would be immortal, right? Because, death didn't come into the world until the sin, the
Does it
fall.
really matter?
I don't think so. As far as our faith is concerned, no. We were supposed to hold that it happened. When it happened, who cares? It happened, right? And it continues to happen because it's an eternal act, right? So, I don't know. I think we got some interesting thoughts, things to contemplate, right? So, and I think that's why this is so fascinating to be Catholic, because these things I don't think people really think about all that much. But there's something to consider, right? Because you can hold any position when it comes to these things, really.
yeah, so I think that her pain will not go away until all of her children are in heaven.
Yes.
Well, and when Mary
Or at least stop affecting her son.
No, all of them in heaven.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
she's united with
Well,
Jesus.
now,
Christ.
hold on now.
Everybody's in
Hold on.
heaven.
We must be careful here, right? Because what you're advocating for is nobody being held. Now we
Well,
hope for
that
that.
would be the desire.
We would hope for that.
That would be the desire.
Is that reality? Well,
Wow,
we never
maybe.
We know there's.
We don't
grace.
know. But then does that mean that people in hell would because not everyone's in heaven, does that cause Mary pain? Well, sure it would. But being, I don't know, it'd be eternal pain. That'd be very cruel. Right?
No, I don't think it's eternal pain then because it's beyond, they've already made their choice. But we do know from the mystics that there are people in hell.
We hope there's not, but yeah, the reality
Well,
is there
Sister
probably is.
Faustina.
Yeah. Well, again, we want to be careful too when it comes to personal revelation, right? Because personal revelation is not necessarily salvation history.
True.
So we definitely can take these things and say, wow, it seems a lot of these saints have had the same kind of vision. Okay, great. But that doesn't
Patrick
necessarily,
Emmerich,
right.
They all have the same thing.
Right.
They didn't like
Right.
this.
And so,
Oh,
but I mean, we
read
don't
about
want to
each
go as
other.
far as saying like, you know, it's still, that's another thing. It's kind of like when it comes to the end times or the end, you know, these things, it would be unrealistic to say there's nobody in hell.
Right.
But we also wouldn't hope that not many people are there. And so these personal revelations, we can look at them and say, oh, that's very interesting, and you know, but not, we don't want to assent as far as being dogmatic about these things, right? Which is why there's certain things like, you know, certain devotions are not obligatory, right? No devotion is obligatory. Right? Yeah. So we want to be very careful about these things, because if you're saying, well, I have to believe this, well, do you?
But we know there's a saint.
Well, sure, yeah. No, that's what I'm saying. There's a clear difference between there's a hell and there are people there, and saying that there's nobody in hell, right? Right. We want to be very clear about that. We don't know for sure, because we know the church does not condemn anybody to hell. All it does is affirm that our people are in heaven, which is great. But even those affirmations of people in heaven, it's still an open question. So that's what's kind of funny and interesting and beautiful and crazy and frustrating about being Catholic, is that there are certain things we need to assent to that are what we call dogma or called doctrine. That we have to hold to be true with our minds, with our hearts, right? We have to fully assent. And these really kind of are centralized on Jesus, who he is, the Trinity, and his life here on earth. Other things, not, I mean, there may be some level of assent and maybe assent of reason, but not necessarily a belief, right? So like, for instance, I have friends who question the canonization of Paul VI. I don't know.
Your question.
Yeah.
My question.
Go ahead, yeah.
I've just been curious about this situation with Archbishop Vigano.
Yeah.
And I know he was very close to John Paul II and Pope Paul VI,
Mhm.
whatever, and the fact that he disagrees with Pope Francis, and now that he's been excommunicated, I don't understand.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think so. I don't have all the details when it comes to Archbishop Vigano. What I understand, the rationale of, and here's what comes to excommunication. A lot of that comes down to responsibility, right? So I, as a priest, I, as an ordained man, I have an obligation because of the oath I've taken to uphold the teachings and the laws of the church, which means I don't necessarily have to agree with the Pope in everything he does or says, but I have to agree he's the Pope. And that's one of the problems, I think, with Archbishop Vigano, is that he kind of fell into this sedevacantis attitude for whatever reason, whether it be political or whatever else, I don't know. But he started promulgating these things as Francis not being the true Pope. Well, that's against your oath, Your Excellency, right? And that is an offense that can be excommunicable. But we have to understand what the purpose of excommunication is, right? It's not to exclude, it's medicinal.
Okay.
It's meant to revise and help that person to understand what the truth is. Which means all he has to do is submit and say, yes, you are the Pope.
Okay.
I agree you are. I'm sorry. That's it.
It's kind of like an extreme timeout to think about.
Yeah. And you're excluded from the sacraments because again, it's for medicinal reasons, that this is this serious that you're not allowed to receive the Eucharist or to act as a priest or as a bishop, right? Because it's so serious. And so it should be something you really should consider.
Well, he was so upset about all the sex abuse and
Rightly so.
Yep.
But again, that doesn't mean
and the financial
yeah.
issues.
Granted,
Carrick.
I am too. Don't get me wrong. I think anyone should be.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean that I say, hey, guess what? You're not the Pope because of that.
Right. Okay. Well, you simplified it and you made me understand
Okay.
it. And I appreciate that because I just didn't understand.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. It's like there's, when it comes to these things of the scandals of the church, and this is something that we also consider too, that this is nothing new, unfortunately. Because the church is made up of human beings, there's always been scandal. That's been the case for time immemorial. One thing always gives me comfort in these actions and these things is I recall this was Monsignor Michael Witt, who's a great historian and a St. Louis priest, and also a former Christian brother, which is kind of neat. Again, Christian brothers are really good. Love them. He was telling a story about Napoleon went to the French cardinals and said some of the facts like, I don't want to, but if I really could, Your Eminence, I could destroy the church. To which this one cardinal responded, Your Excellency, we've been trying to destroy the church for the last 1,800 years, and if we haven't been successful, I don't think you'll be either. Right? So that gives you some comfort in that, right? Yeah. That we truly believe the church can prevail against the gates of hell. That because God, the Holy Spirit, is guiding it, not the Pope, not human forces, then these things are going to happen. And I think when we're faced with these scandals, and this I think where Archbishop Vigano maybe at, we have two options. We can leave, or we can try and stay and change, right? And I think if people decide to leave, it's frustrating. It's kind of sad because we won't hear it actually this year because we've been going through John chapter 6 and the gospel readings on Sunday, right, for the last 3 weeks. This third week coming up, we won't hear the end of that gospel this year, and the reason being is because the fifth Sunday, which would be the conclusion of this gospel, where Peter has this great exclamation of faith, Lord, where will we go? Right? That's the point.
That's what I thought. That's where I thought we were going Sunday.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. And I'm actually considering because I'm preaching this weekend, but next weekend is the deacon. I want to talk to him about this first, but I was thinking about maybe doing the conclusion this weekend because we won't hear this end. That we won't hear that part this year because the Feast of St. Louis takes precedence because August 25th falls on the Sunday this year. And instead of hearing the last part of John 6, we're going to hear the gospel for the Feast of St. Louis. So,
is it optional because we're not in St. Louis?
Apparently not.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, you're right. It's weird because that's you're right. But you're right though because if this day fell on if that day fell on a regular weekday, it's funny because in the way, I don't know who set this up or how they set this up, but within the territory of St. Louis proper, so within the city, it's a solemnity.
Yes, not us.
But outside the city, it's just a feast day.
Yes.
But I think it's kind of the same thing like today, like Transfiguration. When that falls on a Sunday, it takes it takes a solemnity. So even if you're outside the city, it still would be a solemnity, even though. So it's kind of a weird thing. I don't know. But yeah, I don't know who set that up. I'm not sure where that came from. But that's in the Ordo. When you read it, it's like, oh, wait, what? So I've been used to celebrating it as a solemnity because I was in the city for so long. But then now it's like, well, technically it would be a feast day, but it falls on a Sunday, so it's been elevated for everybody. So we won't hear the end of John chapter 6 here. But I think that's kind of the thing. It's like you can leave, but also where are you going to go? Right? Which the other thing I think we need to understand when it comes to excommunication is that it's only for this life. Right. So it was actually an interesting debate a few years ago. They were doing the commemoration of I think it was like 500 years of the Reformation, since the Reformation, right? And there was an action I think it's even further than that. Actually, before that, I think there was a call to lift the excommunication against Martin Luther. Now, does anyone know why that's kind of silly? I don't know.
Well, he's already
He's
deceased.
dead.
He's dead. He's dead,
Yeah.
right? So the excommunication has already been lifted because
You
he's
can now take
dead.
communion.
Right. So it's like, well, wait a minute, so I mean, at this point, it's God's hands. I mean, it's his call. What he wants to do with him. I mean, he's outside our jurisdiction now, right? I think it was done as sort of symbolic gesture, which is fine. But that's kind of the thing that's so odd about these lifting of excommunication. It's like, well, okay, Now, one would hope that someone would reconcile before they die, of course. But excommunication is just for life. It's for our natural life. It doesn't actually go into the supernatural. Or now, one could say, well, doesn't the church bind and loose? Sure. But the fact that Archbishop Vigano received these sacraments already, well, we trust in that grace, right? And we understand that God would judge the person's character. And again, we don't know all the circumstances for people, but there's an objective wrong that he did. And so he has to reconcile that in order to have it lifted. That's the same for anyone excommunicated, unfortunately. But we also trust that God's mercy would still endure. So, yeah.
Unless he does something we don't know. Unless he does something we don't know.
Well, I mean, if he thinks that that's the other thing too. If he does know something, then that means, is that divinely instilled? In which case, why would that not be revealed in a normal channel? And I mean, so again, I mean,
why is he just saying now?
Well, I mean, that's also too, like, why there's certain reasons also why, like, certain things that we like, going in line with Mary. People got very frustrated when Medjugorje was not recognized, right? And the reason that Medjugorje wasn't recognized is because there were certain things that the visionaries were saying that were contrary to church teaching, right? And so it was determined, well, is this a true visionary? Because even personal revelation cannot contradict the teaching of the church. So if let's say you had a saint that said, it's been revealed to me that it wasn't actually Jesus that died on the cross, it's actually God the Father in the guise of Jesus. Well, that's a problem, because that's been promulgated as dogma that it was actually the second person of the Trinity that died on the cross. We can't contradict that. And so even if you're a saint and you promulgate that, we would say that just be wrong. That can't be true. Now, that doesn't negate the fact you're a saint, but it doesn't help your cause either, right, as far as that's concerned. So that's why these things that we recognize as canonization of saints, or even visions of Mary, the church doesn't never definitively teach, like, oh, this person for sure is in heaven, or this for sure happened. What the church says is there's allowed to have a devotion to it. So in other words, not you must, it's you're allowed, right? Never will you see, whether it be a vision of Mary, a canonized saint, or a Eucharistic miracle, where the church says you must believe this. All the church says is you're allowed to, right? But you don't have to.
Right, that's something you need for your faith, and go.
Yeah, if it helps you, great. If not, don't worry about it.
Well, except the Eucharistic miracles, but we have to believe that it is the body and blood
yes.
of Christ.
So the Eucharist, you have to believe the Eucharist is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ.
Right.
Do you have to believe that a host bleeds?
No.
No.
Or that
Right.
it multiplies.
Right, or multiplies. No. Right.
But it might help you.
You have to believe it's Jesus,
Yeah.
but it actually becomes actually a piece of cardiac tissue.
And when they all come out to be AB positive.
Well, I mean, so here's the thing, Connie. I personally believe there's a lot of evidence to show these things are true, right? And I think all that does is kind of confirm what the church has taught for the last 2,000 years. But do I have to believe it actually happened? No. Is there? Because that's what the church does. Are there other explanations, right? Could there be something else that happens? Maybe.
But that's the beauty of our religion, is our faith.
Right. Right. But that's the thing. I mean, that's why the church. That's what I'm saying, though. The church doesn't definitively teach that you must believe that this piece of this host, even though it's body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ, actually started to bleed. You don't have to believe that. You don't have to. Now, you can. You're allowed to, but you don't have to. That's the main difference. Right. And sometimes it's hard, right? Because it's hard for us to kind of like comprehend. Even the Assumption of Mary, I have to believe happened. How it happened?
It's hard to explain that to a non-Catholic.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Well, even Catholics. I mean, even Catholics is hard. I mean, because I think most people will go around and say, well, I have to believe that like Paul VI is truly in heaven. I mean, I hope he is, but I mean, that doesn't affect me personally whether he is or isn't.
Well, but if you're a saint, doesn't that?
You're right. The
Wouldn't
term,
that be the logical
the term
assumption that you're in
saint.
heaven?
You're right. The term saint does mean one who is with God in heaven. That's true. But that's one thing that's kind of very interesting.
And you may disagree with his qualifications.
Yeah,
to be
sure.
a saint.
Sure, right. But like, so like for instance, though, okay, and this is where it gets kind of interesting because I, as a priest, okay, for instance, Thursday. Okay, Thursday is a obligatory memorial. Does anyone know who we're celebrating on Thursday?
Dominic.
Dominic. Saint Dominic.
Yes.
August 8th, Saint Dominic. Now here's the thing. I have to celebrate that Mass in commemoration of Saint Dominic, right? Now, of course, every Mass is a celebration of Jesus, right?
Mhm.
Do I have to believe Saint Dominic is actually in heaven? You should, but
He's a saint.
He's a saint.
That's a pickle, isn't it?
I know, right?
Yeah.
I know. I mean, so I believe he is, but I don't necessarily have to in order to celebrate and commemorate him on the calendar.
So we don't
Because-
have to believe there's people in hell because then you don't have to worry about sinning because there's not going to be anybody.
Right.
So,
Right.
you know, all's forgiven and
Yeah.
God is good.
Well, so do you have to believe there are people in heaven? Yes, I believe there are people in heaven. Right? We need to believe that.
Yeah.
Individuals? That's an open question. Right? You know, do I believe my grandma's in heaven? I hope she is. I don't know. I hope she is. I trust she is.
And you don't know of any reason why she wouldn't be.
Right.
But
Right.
I don't make that call. That's up to God, right? You know, for sure. It's an interesting situation. It's fascinating. Now, personally, I believe that all the saints that the church canonized are in heaven. I believe that. But you can still not believe certain people aren't in heaven and still call yourself Catholic. Back to Paul VI. I think he's in heaven. I think you write something like Humanae Vitae. That was an amazing document that actually defied the times and even defied his own council, right? Now, some argue, though, that he didn't have enough fortitude to actually drive it home to the point where there was any question about it.
Well, there's a lot going on in the Vatican.
Here's the thing. Okay, that may be a fair critique, but yeah, I mean,
That doesn't mean he's not in heaven.
I agree. I know, but people tend to make those arguments.
Yeah, that's
Right.
like,
There's actually some arguments came out against Mother Teresa recently. You know,
they'll argue about it.
I know. I mean, I don't know. You know, whatever.
Yeah, she was crooked.
Yeah.
I think some people. There was some. I think it was more of like, yeah, it was more kind of like a critique about her interaction. Like, so like some people were, I guess, claiming she'd be kind of cold. And it's like, well, yeah, maybe she's in a state of prayer. I don't know.
Eastern European. That's their
They're
norm.
there.
I'm not making that argument. Other people do. I'm just saying.
I know,
Yeah,
but
right.
I'm
Yeah.
just saying. I
Yeah.
used to work with the Russians. That's the way they are.
Yeah. She's Albanian, so I mean, sure.
Yeah.
Not too far away. Yeah.
Whatever.
So I
Yeah.
mean, but I also could she also be in a state of prayer to where she was kind of like directed,
Yeah,
focused on
that's
something
true,
else.
too.
I don't
Or
know,
in the
maybe.
state of constantly battling demons.
Yeah. I mean, I have a brother priest of mine that he prays the rosary very often, as he should, and sometimes he'll be in this kind of state where he's not recognizing people are like trying to contact him. He's not doing it purposefully, but that comes off as sort of like, oh wow, this jerk, he doesn't even acknowledge me. Yeah, sorry, maybe you should. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but also he's in a state of prayer. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Some of us have trouble multitasking, so it takes all kinds in that respect. Saint Jerome also was not a very pleasant person to be around, apparently, which actually I think gives us all some hope. I think in some ways,
He lived in a cave.
he was not a people person. As a matter of fact, I think it was said that even though he met some people, what did you say he was what?
Former engineer.
Oh, wow, man, oh man.
Hey, they live in caves. I know one. I used to live with one.
You know, it's you.
I know.
So it was said that when he would meet, like he would meet with people sometimes, like seeking counsel, or whatever. And they said he died, they checked his desk where he had in his area when he did his studies, and they saw grooves in his desk because he was gripping the table so hard. He was putting imprints of his fingers into it because he was just so frustrated about what was being said. And he never showed it, but it was like, so I guess that's the point, is that saints come in every different packages, right? We have to believe there are saints. That's the point, right? So good. All right.
Cool.
Well, thanks for coming, guys. Appreciate it.
There's food in there.
Yeah, let's go.
Yeah, let's go.
All right, we're gonna eat. Sorry, bye.